Hello everybody, welcome to a new chess opening tutorial, and today we're going to look at my favorite opening, the Najdorf Sicilian. So what is the Najdorf Sicilian? First of all, thanks for the suggestion by Eskil OJ, great video. He says, I have a suggestion for you, the Najdorf Sicilian. Let's do it. Yes, alright. I mean, I want to do this opening at some point anyway, for sure. And this will be actually tricky because I know a lot about the Najdorf and I have to make sure I convey everything concise and this doesn't get too long. So how do we get to the Najdorf Sicilian? First of all, here after e4, c5, this is called the Sicilian opening, Sicilian defense. And now after d4, we have the open Sicilian, marked by the move d4. Why open? Because now the center is opened up. Knight f6, knight c3, and here black has many choices. And today we'll look at the most popular Sicilian there is, a6, Najdorf Sicilian. So you might wonder, why a6? Why not develop a piece, right? Well, a6 is just a very useful move in many variations anyway, because black takes away the square b5 from the white pieces, the knights and the bishop, and many cases black will play b5 later on, which will allow him to put his bishop on b7 and put more pressure on the central pawn on e4. As well as, if you can imagine this in your mind, push the pawn forward to b4 and attack the knight on c3. So for all of these reasons, a6 makes a lot of sense. And with this move, black still stays flexible. He doesn't commit yet to developing the knight to c6 or to d7. And it's also a useful waiting move to see what white is going to do next. For example, if we compare this with e6, which is also, you could say, a useful move, here white has an interesting choice available, g4, to immediately push the pawns forward. And with a6, this is not the case. Here, obviously, g4 could be just taken by the bishop or by the knight. So a6, a useful waiting move. And white has pretty much tried everything under the sun against the Najdorf. Everything. a3, a4, h4, h3, g3, f3, f4, rook g1, bishop e3, bishop g5, bishop e2, bishop c4, knight b3, queen d3, queen f3. Okay, I think you get the idea, right? So obviously I cannot talk about all these moves, but I want to talk about some of them, just to give you an idea of what kind of positions you can expect. So I would say the four bishop moves are the main moves. So bishop e3, bishop g5, bishop e2, and bishop c4. Even though bishop c4, let's begin with this move, has lost a lot of popularity because it turned out that the bishop is often not that well placed on this diagonal. Black usually goes e6. Now white plays bishop b3, just prophylactically. And here black has two main choices, either playing with b5 or playing with knight bd7. Knight bd7 is the move I prefer. And then the point is that the knight is coming to c5, which makes a lot of sense because for one, black is attacking this pawn, and for the other, he can exchange this bishop if he needs to. And here, white has different moves. He can sacrifice a pawn on e4 with castle, he can play queen f3, he can go f5 and e5, but in all these lines, it seems that black is okay. So this is not really seen that much anymore, at least on the high level. Still, it can get quite dangerous, but it can get quite dangerous for both sides. White can also be easily worse in these lines. So that's all I want to say about bishop c4, because like I said, we have a lot to cover here and I don't want this to get too long. Let's look at bishop e2. This is a move for people who like to play rather quiet positions. Bishop e2 prepares the short castle, and in most cases white is actually castling short, and then he will take a more positional approach to the Najdorf. And here, as in many cases, black has to decide on the structure he wants. He can either play with e6, which is called a Scheveninger structure, or he can play with e5. So the main difference between the two is if black goes with e6, then he has less space and the knight stays on d4, but he stays also more flexible. He can go e5 later on, he can go d5 maybe more easily as the pawn is still supporting d5. And his pawns are just more flexible. This is, I would say, the main difference. In these positions though, it's also easier for white to maybe get something going here with pushing the pawns forward. Let's compare this real quick to bishop e2, e5, when white usually plays knight b3. Recently knight f3 also gained some popularity. But what I want to say here about the structure in general is that now this is a very important square, the square d5, because no black pawn is covering this square. And if white can install a knight there without having it being attacked or questioned, then this can be quite strong for white. And also in these lines, the pawn on d6 is more of a weakness because it's a backward pawn and black always has to defend it. Whereas in the other position, it's also a weakness, but it's easier to push d5 with the pawn on e6, right? On the other hand, black has more space. He can develop the bishop to e6 here, which is usually the best square for the bishop. And if he can get to d5 at some point, this is the main goal for black in this line as well as in many other lines, is to push d5. It's always the central fight about whether white can occupy the d5 square, keep controlling it and put pressure on the pawn on d6, or whether black is able to push d5, and if he can do so without big compromise, then he usually equalizes, or in some cases can be better as well. So this is the big difference between those two kind of structures. In a nutshell, of course, we cannot go into too much detail here. Maybe I'll do a video later on in which I go into more detail in the main lines. But first, let me tell you about the other bishop moves here. Bishop g5, this is my personal favorite move, the most aggressive move there is against the Najdorf. White develops this bishop and prepares to castle queenside in most of the lines. And just to give you a sample line here, e6, f4, bishop e7, just to see how this game develops here. And now white pushes the pawns forward. This is a lot of theory here and it's very sharp. But just to give you an idea, this is the old main line. White sacrifices the pawn g5, but gets very active play and good compensation for the pawn. And this is, of course, over the board quite dangerous for black. Of course, there are many other lines here, but just to give you a taste, and bishop g5 is definitely a move you need to check carefully if you want to play the Najdorf with the black pieces. That leaves us with bishop e3, which is considered to be the main move. Same idea here, white wants to play f3, support the pawns, and then go for g4 and play queen d2, queenside castle. I'm saying same idea in terms of white wants to go for a queenside castle and also push the kingside pawns forward, just in a little bit different manner, as you can see. And here black again has to make this choice, e6 or e5. However, there's also another move, knight g4 here, which leads to completely different kind of positions like this. And this is quite a different animal, not so typical for the Najdorf to see the pawns like this, but also an interesting variation and reasonable for black to play. So once again here e6, after both these moves, play will most likely develop in the same kind of nature. White prepares the queenside castle and black does something else. He can go b4 here, it's an interesting move. You can also go knight bd7, castle, and now b4. And there are a lot of lines here, honestly. And I would need to actually rehearse them myself again, but it can get very sharp very early, and it's really this struggle between who will come first. Will white get something going with his pawns here, or will be black in time to develop his pieces, push d5, open the position, and maybe also get an attack going against the white king? After e5, it's somewhat similar in regards to that black's also developing his pieces like this, and I think I should have played f3 earlier. Okay, let's do this correctly. Knight b3, bishop e6, f3 to stop knight g4. And now white is developing his pieces. Of course, he can also play differently, but this is the main line just to show you, just to give you a sample line here, g4, b5, and now g5 and b4. This is the main line, and here white has different moves available, of course. He can move the knight, he can also take on f6, and it can get quite interesting here. I think the main move is knight e2. Well, I don't want to get into too much details, but as you can see already by the nature of the position that the kings have castled in opposite directions, it can get super sharp because both sides are trying to attack each other, right? And this is a complex struggle, and this is really what makes the Najdorf so interesting for many players, because you get rich positions, tactical positions, and you can play for a win with black. The Najdorf is considered to be one of the best openings if you want to play for a win with the black pieces, but really a lot of Sicilians are considered that. So this was my quick overview. There's so much more I could talk about, but I think that really summarizes some of the main ideas and main variations that you can expect in the Najdorf. If you want to play this opening, you really need to study your theory, because otherwise you might get crashed with either color. If you don't know what you're doing, it can get really dangerous. So this is my overview. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, feel free to subscribe and leave a like, and let me know if you have any further suggestions for future videos. Alright, see you next time. Bye bye.